This is the Cloud Security Today podcast, where leaders learn how to get cloud security done. And now your host, Matt Chiodi.
On this month's podcast, we once again have Jay and Q from Unit 42's threat research team, that's Palo Alto Network's elite threat research group, to talk about volume 6 of their cloud threat report. And it's funny, I went back and looked, and you'll hear me talk about this a little bit during the show. Jay and Q have been on the show now 3 times, simply because people find the research so interesting and so useful, and they're just generally fun to talk to. So in this report, they go very deep into identity and access management in the cloud, so IAM. If you are not overly technical, I don't think it matters. You're going to get something out of this. I encourage you to listen, because identity and access management is often one of the biggest holes in cloud applications. So here, what we'll be talking about is mostly infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, but it also applies to SaaS. Now, a lot of times people think, well, I've got my SaaS app, the vendor's taking care of the underlying platform, the underlying infrastructure. But when it comes to the permissions, the identity and access management, this is where you, as the consumer of that platform, need to be mindful, because you can have defense in depth, but if you've got some simple identity misconfigurations, I can weave my way all the way around those defenses. So pay attention, take notes, and enjoy the podcast. One other thing, I only do these on a monthly basis. So this podcast was originally recorded in September of 2022. So if you hear any date references that sound off, you'll know why. But enjoy the episode. And again, if you've got feedback, we would love to hear from you. Just send us an email at cloudsectoday@gmail.com. That's cloudsectoday@gmail.com. JQ, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Matt.
Cool. So, you guys, I think, are my only repeat guest on the show. And this will probably be your third appearance, if I
it is.
do
Number
it right.
3, pretty awesome.
Isn't it Alec Baldwin who's been on Saturday Night Live like more than any other guest? You guys are like my Alec Baldwin on the show. So I appreciate it.
Such a compliment. Oh man.
Awesome. So, all right. So we're here to chat about the latest Cloud Threat Report, Volume 6. And I really love this one, right? So I'm a big fan of these reports. And anytime you guys delve into identity and access management, I always find it super interesting. So I think what's interesting, if people have not read the Cloud Threat Reports, they can go out to unit42.paloaltonetworks.com. You can find all the threat research there. I know you guys do regular threat research, even outside of these kind of big bang threat reports. But this isn't the first time that you've looked at identity and access management in the cloud. So my question is, what's changed over the last year? And then either one of you guys jump in.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead, Jay.
I can. Sure, I have the short version. Yeah, I really like IAM, and it's a fun and challenging research topic to look into. So in the past, we mainly look into how to abuse and exploit IAM to achieve certain goals. For example, we look at how misconfiguration can allow attacker to identify misconfigured cloud resource exposed to the public internet, or how misconfiguration can allow adversary to anonymously access into a cloud environment, or how abusing multiple permission can achieve privilege escalation. So that's what we looked at before. But in this report, the biggest difference is that we got access to millions of records. This is the first time that we had visibility into so many real data in real cloud environment, in production cloud environment, and we were able to analyze these identities to understand how people provision, manage, and used identities in cloud environment. And this is a very unique perspective.
So this isn't a survey, right? So you said this is real data from real cloud environments?
Absolutely not.
That's pretty awesome. It's
Correct.
pretty unique. I don't know if I've read anything else like this then that has hands-on real environments, not survey-based. So this is pretty interesting. Q, from your perspective, what's changed over the last year?
Yeah, I couldn't say any better than Jay did. But I mean, with the real data, just the sheer number of identities that we were able to look at, I mean, 680,000 individual unique identities. It's amazing to have that kind of visibility into how things are working. Within the CTR, I like looking specifically at the intel, like who are the actors that are performing and working on these particular operations. And so we spend a lot of time and research looking at what are the actors, what are they doing, how are they targeting. So really like, who were they, how are they doing it, and what were they targeting? And so, taking that real world misconfiguration capability and then mixing that with what actors are actually targeting and looking at made for this report to be pretty awesome.
So not just talking about like, here's the issues that we found, right? Like whether it be misconfigurations, overly permissive identities. I know we'll get into that in a little bit here in a minute, but you guys looked at who's actually taking advantage of these. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And then how are they doing it, or how successful were they in doing that? So it's pretty interesting. Kind of leveraging that Unit 42 threat intel metrics and that telemetry we get from that Unit 42 from the wider networking industry, and kind of push that into cloud and see these are actual actors targeting cloud. They're actually targeting identities specifically, and this is how they're doing it.
So when we think about identity and access management in the cloud, right? Every CSP has their own kind of native solution, right? That they offer as part of the platform. And this is what I think you guys are talking specifically about, right? This is what you looked at. So for example, AWS has their own service. Azure has Azure AD, right? In the back end. Google, I actually don't know what they have, but the two big ones right there. Those are the two primary ones that I assume that you guys looked at in this research. So and let's also say that both of those, both what AWS has as well as what Azure has, those are not new, right? These technologies, these offerings have been out there. Obviously, they continue to make changes and new services, but the basic offerings have been in place for years. So we're not talking about things that are in beta or have just been put out there. So the question I want to put to you guys is why is good governance around identity and access management so difficult in the cloud versus on premises? Or maybe it's not. Maybe it's the same level of difficulty. I'm curious for your feedback. Jay, why don't I start with you, and then Q, if you want to chime in.
Sure. So I think IAM governance in both, I think IAM governance in general is equally challenging and difficult in both on-prem and in the cloud. And however, they may have different pain points. Like I can give a few examples of why IAM governance in cloud environment is challenging. The first is the number of permissions. So if we look at the number of permissions that available in AWS environment at the time of this report, they offer more than 23,000, actually, more than 23,000 different permissions. And these numbers continue to grow. So nobody can really catch up with the number of permissions they keep releasing with new features and service. So it is very hard for anyone to be able to fully understand all the permissions of just one single service. And another challenge is the number of identities, the number of users, like human users and non-human users, human identities and non-human identities in cloud environment. One interesting difference is that there are more non-human identities in the cloud than actual human identities. And this poses a challenge because as the number of workloads in the cloud environment grow, there will be more identities. And because of the distributed manner and service-oriented manner of cloud service, almost every application and every service in your cloud environment needs at least one identity. And however, cloud cloud is a fast-changing environment. A lot of time when your work is depreciated, there are still identity lingering around in your source code, in your logs, or in document. And these lingering identities can pose significant risk to your cloud environment. And finally, I think the third challenge is a non-unified way of managing identities. Like the fundamental concept of IAM is the same, has never changed, but the approach to managing and provisioning IAM differs significantly across cloud environment, across different CSPs. For example, in AWS, IAM is identity-centric, meaning that you create a permission policy and attach it to a user. You provision user-specific access to specific resource. But in GCP and Azure, identities are resource-centric, meaning that you have a permission policy and you attach permission policy to specific resource, and this resource allow who can access that resource. So conceptually, they are very different. And another example is that in Azure and GCP, identities are granted in an hierarchical way. But this concept does not exist in AWS, at least in a single account. There's no hierarchy relationship in AWS. So if you are given a compliance policy, it is not straightforward to translate a single policy into multiple clouds. So that's another big challenge, is that there's no unified way of managing and understanding.
That would definitely add a lot of complexity, right? Because I know every organization I speak with is operating in almost all of the clouds you mentioned, right? They maybe they have a preponderance in one, but they almost always, I remember talking with customers and saying, they're like, oh, I only have AWS. I'm like, are you sure you don't have any projects in Azure? And they'd be like, well, yeah, we do. We've got, but they're not big, right? So, but everybody has at least two, usually three. Yeah, they either have shadow IT or it's just some, quote unquote small project that's probably a lot bigger than they think it is. And then you've got the complexity, like you said, that they're not the same. They're very different in terms of how they work. And so if you try to then manage that with any scale, I think that probably is what leads to a lot of the things we'll be talking about here in terms of what you found. Q, how do you see this?
Yeah, I mean, the complexity is it just grows. I mean, if you have exponential growth, every cloud platform put onto it, they don't speak the same language in the background as Jay was talking about. If I would put one example in there, it would be probably the latest, headline thing with Uber, and that compromise that they had there. It started out with just a phishing email. A user just got hit with a phishing email, and then they had access, or that user had access to an internal share, an intranet, and that intranet had PowerShell scripts, and that PowerShell script had administrative access to both GCP and Azure. Two different backends. We still have to think about a user at the front end who's operating or who may have access to other things in a traditional networked environment that we should all have security for, but they were still able to pull hard-coded credentials out of those PowerShell scripts and get to two different cloud service providers. And if we go back to earlier in this year, Palo Alto had their cloud security report, which is mostly a survey data. But interesting things on it was we had 60% plus of the organizations that were surveyed were in two or three or cloud organizations. So doesn't matter how small, you could have like nothing in GCP in the case of like, say, Uber, and then, your Azure is a major piece, and then you still get compromised, side channel into that environment. So actors are seeing these things, or at least maybe not intentionally targeting those things, but they are definitely taking advantage of those opportunities.
Well, let's jump over to the research. So what did you find when it comes to how permissions are used in cloud identities?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty significant. I mean, 99% of cloud organizations are overly permissive, and it's a terrible, fear and distraction sort of number. 99% is like, is that real? That's not real. But no, it's actually a real environment, and we start looking at, just a single, identity and access management policy has permissions, so that permission capability that it has access to. 99% of those are overly permissive to that system or that resource that they were going to use. I mean, that number alone is completely staggering. in that aspect.
When you guys say overly permissive, how do you define that? Because I guess what it means, like anytime I hear a statistic that's like that big, I hear a 99% number, I always think, okay, well, how do you define overly permissive? Because obviously, what one organization might consider overly permissive may not be what, somebody who's regulated by NERC, right? The Nuclear Energy Regulatory Commission may consider something very, very permissive. And then somebody on the other side, maybe like a startup might be like, that's not risky at all. So I'm curious, how do you guys define, how do you define that?
Yeah, so we define an identity overly permissive if this identity were granted permissions that were not used in the past 60 days, meaning that there were excessive permissions that are not necessary for this identity in the past 60 days. And what we found, as Q mentioned, is 99% or 99% of identities have excessive permissions. And looking at this problem from another angle is that we also look at how the granted permissions are actually used by each identity. What we found is that only, on average, only less than 10% of the granted identities were actually used, meaning that if an identity is granted 100 different permissions, but usually this identity only use less than 10 permissions. So 90% of the permission can be revoked without impact the functionality of the identity, but significantly reduce the risk of the identity.
And this actually goes back to what Jay was saying earlier. The majority of identities are non-human. I mean, there's service accounts that are performing a lot of these operations. So a service account should be well defined when you start that service. And you should know exactly which permissions it needs to have before it even starts running. And it seems to be that when we're configuring or building most of our cloud infrastructure or using an infrastructure as code template or something of that nature, we're just overly giving that resource just way too much access to other things that it doesn't need to even touch in its normal automated function.
So it sounds like, from my experience that, I know we don't have the data, at least in the report, for like what this is in the on-premises world, but my guess from years of experience is that it's probably very similar. Maybe not even as bad. It may be even tighter on premises than it is in the cloud. But I know a lot of times, I had, thinking back to my early days as an admin, when you couldn't figure something out, what do? You add more permissions, right? You're like, let me give it a power user or an admin access, and then I'll go back later and I'll figure it out, right? I'll take the permissions away later. And you guys know human nature, right? It works. So you move to the next step or the next project, and rarely ever do you come back and fix those permissions. Now multiply that out by however many people, how many admins, DevOps, right? Working on stuff, unless they're actually filing bugs and tracking these things. It just ends up as tech debt, right? So
the same thing with, like, say, developers. Developers just want to build the thing and make it work to satisfy like a first to market requirement, or it's a major push for the organization to get to the cloud as fast as they can. So they're just going to push as hard as they can. And developers, they just want to build the thing and then go to the next project. And so they usually start out with root access for most things, just because they don't have to worry about any issues to stop their dev process.
So 99% are overly permissive. And if I heard you right, you guys define overly permissive meaning that for more than 2 months or 60 days, a permission that was granted has not been utilized. So that means 2 months have gone by, an application is running, it's utilizing a service account in some capacity, and it hasn't called for its permissions. And I think if I remember the next statistic right, it was at 90% of those that are granted are not even used. So it's like only 10% are effectively used. I don't know, is that over the course of those 60 days?
Right.
Okay. So
yes.
So if you're a developer and you're listening, it means you need to go back and you need to remember that somewhere in the neighborhood of 90% of the permissions you thought you needed, you probably don't. So this is just a violation of what we've been talking about a long time in cybersecurity, which is the principle of least privilege, which is like everybody agrees. I haven't met anybody that says, least privilege doesn't make any sense. Everybody's like, yes, least privilege makes sense. But it's the putting it into practice and operationalizing it and making it a standard in an organization, that's really I think it's really the hard part. So this begs the question, so are the cloud service providers, are they being helpful in terms of what they offer out of the box when it comes to IAM policies?
So I do think cloud service providers try their best to help to make their users more secure. So out-of-box policies are designed to accommodate millions of users. Cloud service provider provide this out-of-box policy to help users quickly bootstrap their application, start the new service, instead of spending time understanding every single permission needed to start a new workload. And by design, these out-of-box policies need to be permissive and broad. So the issues that we found that, which I will mention a little bit, these issues are not CSP's fault by any way. They try their best to create and manage hundreds of different services for cloud users. And however, this is really the responsibility of the users when using the cloud resources. You can definitely start with out-of-box services, and you are encouraged to do so to make your adoption more smooth and less error prone. But whenever like at some point when your workloads become more mature, more predictable, it is the user's responsibility to create a customized policies for your workload. And cloud service providers also offer such services to help you create more least privilege type of permission policy. So there are services and tools out there, but it is up to the users who actually implement it.
Yeah. I mean, just like we were talking about just a moment ago, I mean, like the big statistic out of this was that we looked at we looked at the top 5 of the most used cloud service provider policies. So what are those cloud service providers managed policies that are the most used among all of the cloud organizations we found? And looking specifically within AWS, administrator access was number 3. And then on the Azure side, owner access, which is the same as administrator access, was number 2. So those are the most frequently used policies that are being used from cloud, for cloud environments. And we just talked about why. I mean, we want things to work, and the best way to make things work is to give them all the access, and then we get most of our, no problems. It'll work. However, that's administrative access, and so there's a level of education that needs to have. I mean, to quick lift and shift into the cloud, sure, you want more permissions in order to make sure that you can remain, productive and have that, we all need the dollars coming in, which means we need to create in order for that to happen. And so just the easiest way to get there is to use administrator access. So that education aspect, you don't have to have administrator access. You could probably just, can you get away with, EC2, read-only access, or do you need Lambda, execution-only process on this particular service? It just depends on, again, having that education of what cloud managed service policies are better fit for that particular process.
It seems like this would be a good use case with infrastructure as code, right? Where you can, if an organization has any scale or they're moving towards any scale in the cloud, everything they create should not be net new, right? Meaning that this shouldn't be, hey, this is the first time we've ever done this. So if someone utilizes infrastructure as code, they've tested something out, this is where you can work through like reduction of privileges, right? Like how far down can I actually minimize things before it breaks, right? And then once you figure that out for, service X, you should be able to put that into a template, right? That way, every time something's being created from that template, it's getting that minimized set of permissions. So I think that's interesting. I don't know, Jay, do you have any JRQ feedback on that?
Yeah, there's one important stat I forgot to mention is that our research, one very interesting finding from this research is that we compare how permission policies are used. And like we look into how permission policies are used, and we compare the out-of-box policies and policy created by user. And we found that in general, like on average, out-of-box policies granted 2.5 times more permissions than customer managed policy. And also on average, out-of-box, the permission usage rate of out-of-box policy is 2.5 lower than the customer managed policy. So referring back to previous stack, I mentioned less than 10% of the granted permissions are used in all the permission policy. But this permission usage rate if we look at this permission usage rate for out-of-box policies, their usage rate is below 1%. So that's why I'm saying, that's why I want to mention that we are not blaming CSP for offering this out-of-box policies. They try their best to scope for each of their service. If they did not offer such managed policy, most of the user will just use the admin to run off their workload.
Right.
The problem will be even worse. But with this managed policy, at least they help cloud users to scope their workload to specific services such as Kubernetes or your virtual machine or your Lambda functions. So they are still.
There's one thing that I do want to say, Jeff, I can jump in there real fast. I mean, it kind of gets a bad rap, but the DevSecOps, sort of acronym or moniker or whatever you want to call it, it's people are like, we don't need get that out of there. It's just bottlenecking and closing things down. But having that active communication between your security team and your DevOps when you're doing that whole CI/CD pipeline of building and developing and then producing and then, making sure security is in that loop. I mean, permission set really need to have that conversation. If we're building something, if we're making an infrastructure as code template to scale rapidly, I mean, make sure that your security team is involved and at least knows, and it has an angle to look at identities specifically in those particular templates. It will help tremendously.
Prisma Cloud secures infrastructure, applications, data, and entitlements across the world's largest clouds, all from a single unified solution. With a combination of cloud service provider APIs and a unified agent framework, users gain unmatched visibility and protection. Prisma Cloud also integrates with any continuous integration and continuous delivery workflow to secure cloud infrastructure and applications early in development. You can scan infrastructure as code templates, container images, serverless functions, and more while gaining powerful, full-stack runtime protection. This is unified security for DevOps and security teams. To find out more, go to prismacloud.io. One of the big pieces of news and innovation in the report that I found super interesting was the introduction of an industry-first cloud threat actor index. So my question is what does it do, and how can companies use this to help secure their cloud environments? Q, I know this was your baby, so why don't you tell us about it?
Sure. I mean, I love cloud threat actors, I like actors just in general and how they work. I guess the quick and dirty of it would be that if you were going into, like, say, an MMA cage fight or something of that nature, and you didn't know what that person was doing or what the techniques they were using to like knock you out, I mean, you would be done in 5 seconds, right? Knowing and studying how adversaries move and how they operate or what they're more prone to do or when they're in specific situations, that's the goal of the Cloud Threat Actor Index. It's what are the actors, identifying who's actually targeting us, what are the tactics and techniques they're using to perform those operations, and then can we learn from that? So there's two aspects of the Cloud Threat Actor Index that are very helpful. One piece is something called a Unit 42 atom, which is essentially it's a MITRE ATT&CK framework structure of a given actor's operation set. So it'll give you the specific tactics that they're performing, like this is how they perform, initial access. This is how they perform lateral movement. This is how they perform privilege escalation, etc. And then it takes those pieces, each one of those techniques that they use to perform those tactics, and then it gives us the very quick, easy indicators of compromise that were used to perform that. These are the IP addresses they were targeting from, or their command and control infrastructure was hosted on. These are the hash values that their malware was actually using. Some of those, if you're looking at the pyramid of pain when it comes to threat intelligence, the easy pieces being the hash values, the IPs, the domains, those are all given as open source information via the Unit 42 Atom framework. So a security practitioner would be able to quickly take those, put those into their security tool, and you'd be able to be defended or at least monitored or alerted for those particular indicators. When it comes to like the behavioral side of it, like how are the actors actually moving and operating, you can say, well, these are the sets they're primarily targeting. And the big thing that we found all of the cloud threat actors using, every single one of them was targeting identity specifically. They were compromising a system, and they were pulling out what are the access tokens this particular cloud endpoint has. Are there other configuration files in that system that we could use to laterally move from container to container, escape the container, or go to the cloud itself and then build other services and processes. So that's the power of that Cloud Threat Actor Index. It tells us who's doing it, tells us how it's doing it, and it tells us what they're looking for.
So I know there's, you cover 5 different threat actor groups in the report. We obviously don't have time to go through all 5 of them, but which did you find most interesting out of those 5 and why?
Yeah, just real fast. So they've been talked about many times, but they're called Team TNT within Unit 42. We call them Adept or Libra Adept. And what they do primarily, why they're so interesting, they're supposedly retired right now. We'll see if that sticks or not. But
threat actors retire? They get like Social Security and like 401ks?
I'm tired of collecting all this data. I just don't want to do it anymore. I don't know. But what's really interesting about them is why we call them adept specifically, is because their usage of automation was impressive. They had this repository, you could call it their swan song of their last action before they retired. It was called the Chimera repository. And Chimera is, multi-headed, dragon sort of thing, or, mythos. And, or is that Hydra? Chimera is the dog, isn't it? No, that's Cerberus. Anyway, so, but what they did is within 48 hours of after this repository was published online, they had over 5,000 cloud endpoints pulling back into it, like compromised with that system. What this repository also did, it had a specific thing called, grab data or AWS grab data, or even search. They just did a search command, and it would, after compromise, it would immediately look in that particular container instance or whatever they compromised and pull back 14 different cloud applications and 2 different cloud service providers, AWS and GCP, and it would look specifically for the identity and access management credentials of those applications or of those cloud platforms. Using that data, they would just pull that back into their command and control repository, and they had all of those credentials. So they said within 48 hours, they had 5,000 plus different cloud endpoints. And if we're thinking that 99% of cloud, our organizations are overly permissive, and they most likely are using, administrator access in those particular instances. If we do 99% of 5,000, that's 4,950 of those endpoints had administrator rights or overly permissive access in those particular identity pools. So it's pretty staggering that could be the worst case scenario, right? That we could project. But that's what makes this particular cloud threat actor, or the techniques that they were doing, so critical for us to understand and build defenses against.
It sounds like at the enterprise security teams should be taking a page out of their book in terms of leveraging automation. It sounds like the attacker in this case is not just one step ahead, but many steps ahead of where many enterprise security programs are.
That's good. So scary stuff. But I don't want to stay on this too much. I mean, there's things that we can do. We can literally stop so much of this from happening. Automation is our friend,
With AI and ML, right? Just joking. I'm sure that's a part of it. But so all this, leads me just to be further convinced that IAM security is extremely complex, especially in the cloud. Let's just kind of wind things down here I'm curious, what are maybe 1 or 2 recommendations you have for security teams who are looking to up their game when it comes to IAM security in the cloud?
Can
Absolutely.
I offer more than 2?
Not 10.
I think I have
no
like
time
10.
for 10. Give me 2 or 3.
Right. So first, enforce multi-factor authentication for all the human identity. Sometimes MFA is not possible or too difficult for non-human identity. And second, use identity providers such as Azure AD or Okta to log into your cloud environment. This way, you have a central management for auth and visibility to all of your identities. And periodically scan for all of your identities and identify the unused identity and remove those identities. And finally, use tools provided by third parties or cloud service provider. In AWS, there's a service called IAM Access Analyzer. And in GCP, there's a service called IAM Recommender. Okay, IAM Recommender. This service can help you generate least privilege permission policy based on the API usage history. So I think I give 4.
Sure. I think Jay's being a little humbling and modest there. He also wrote an amazing tool called IAM Deescalate. And what it will do is it will look in your AWS environment and look at the potential paths that a specific identity has before it can get to, like, say, a root access or privilege escalation. And once it finds one of those, it will create policies automatically that will stop that particular attack escalation path from occurring. So a very useful tool. It's also on Unit 42's GitHub and Palo Alto's GitHub repo as well. So that's a free tool.
So if I Google IAM Deescalate, I will find it. And if not, just go to the Unit 42 or Palo's GitHub repo and you'll find that tool. That's pretty awesome. Now, that's specific to AWS. Yeah. That does not work in Azure. Is that right?
That's correct.
Not yet. You're working on it, maybe. No. I know they're totally different how AWS does IAM versus Azure. It's probably.
I got a lot of requests. I mean, it's possible. I just don't have time to work on it now.
See, the community, it's in GitHub. Someone needs to fork it, and they need to make another version that supports Azure.
There's
definitely good.
One more thing that I could say is CNAP, or Cloud Native Application Protection Platform. It's kind of a new-ish term. People, vendors are picking it up and using pieces with it. So it is pretty vendor agnostic. So depending on which platform you're using or security vendor you're going through. But what the Cloud Native or the CNAP is to bring all the different types of cloud security together under kind of one security umbrella. So everything from code scanning to identity scanning to governance, risk and compliance to cloud workload protection and network security. Those 5 pillars all come together underneath that CNAP umbrella, and it kind of gives you a bigger picture of if an attack were to happen, you can follow it through its different phases.
And I think Palo Alto Networks has one. I think it's called Prisma Cloud. And I think they're a sponsor of this podcast. Isn't that funny? Anyway, no, but you're right. There's different ways of doing it. And from speaking with both on the consulting work I do with IANs and from previous experience, I know that most CISOs and security teams are absolutely overwhelmed with just a number of security tools they have. So the power of having all of those capabilities for cloud, including identity and access management, in one security tool like a Prisma Cloud or a CNAP, whatever one you may choose, is extremely powerful, right? So I always tell people when they're looking at it, in fact, I have a consulting call coming up later today where someone's asking me this very question. And, you've got to go out, you've got to do your proof of concepts. But I always tell people at the end of the day, having one of these CNAP tools is better than not having one, or better than having 10 tools that are trying to achieve what a single tool could potentially do for you. Is way more powerful because it allows you to get the best value from the tool. You're not trying to train your staff on 10, 15 different tools, rather just one. So I appreciate that. That's great feedback. So you guys are threat researchers, which means you have to stay on top of what's happening. And there's news breaking every day. There's another breach. There's some kind of new exploit. There's some new vulnerability. I'm curious, how do each of you stay up to date and keep learning? So Q, I'll start with you, and then Jay, we'll let you take it home.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always reading. I'm always getting, alerts and notifications of different security newsletters and different things like that across multiple different topics. I think it's important to kind of stay kind of broad, so you can capture, a wide enough net of information. If there's one thing that I could say that it's very helpful, it's kind of an easy step into the whole cloud security platform or security process for cloud. It's something called the Cloud Sec list. It's managed by a fellow named Marco. I've never met him personally, but I would like to. But the Cloud Sec list is just cloudseclist.com. And every Sunday, U.S. time, early morning, it will populate the latest trends of cloud security topics that have happened for that week prior. It's a really good recap rundown of what's happening in the cloud security industry in general, and usually have some really good insights. It's only once a week, so if you miss, if something happens on Tuesday, you might miss that. That's where Twitter is good for, and some of those scraping tools that you could use.
Awesome. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. Cloud SEC list, Cloud Sec list. Jay, how about you?
Yeah, so I got most of my information from social media, like Twitters and newsletters. I have another one that I really like. It's called
TLDR. I get that
TLDR. It's by Clint from R2C. So it's not just on cloud, but this newsletter is for application security in general, but usually it has a section for cloud security, and it is one of my favorite.
I love it. All right. So one last question. Can you guys share as to what you're working on next in your research, or is it top secret?
Nothing we work on is top secret.
Eventually.
Yeah.
I mean, we're definitely looking at. We've done a lot of reports, like we said, with this last CTR was the second IAM or identity access management topic that we focused on. We're looking at broadening that, perhaps looking at code scanning, looking at identity in maybe a slightly different way. There's definitely going to be some more cloud threat actors. The next volume of the index is going to be in there. So some good stuff.
That's awesome. So that's very cool. I'm curious, are there any plans to create, with the Cloud Threat Actor Index, is there any plans to do anything separate from the report to make that either more real time, or is there anything I guess I'm curious, how are you guys looking at the next kind of iteration of the Cloud Threat Actor Index?
Yeah, I mean, the Cloud Threat Actor Index is, its ultimate, goal is to be timely and relevant for any major event that's happening that's targeting cloud environments, and the actors or the groups that are behind those particular operations. There's been a lot of work done. If you look at, like say SolarWinds, that was attributed to the Nobelium group or APT 29. They also had just a very impressive attack focused or using both Dropbox as well as Google Cloud as far as command and control infrastructure. So there's a lot of callbacks into that. APT 10 or China Chopper. There's a lot of good information on those. So the goal is to be timely and relevant with as new actors and techniques are coming in, that we're updating that as fast as we find new information.
I love it.
You can find a lot of that on also Unit 42 Atoms. We're in there as well.
Awesome. Well, Jay and Q, it's been great chatting with you today. It's always good. So if they want to go out and download a full copy of the report, again, you can go to unit42.paloaltonetworks.com, one of the world's longest domain names that I frequently misspelled while I was working there. And I'm glad to be at a company now where the domain name's only 4 letters. But if you go to unit42.paloaltonetworks.com, you can find the latest cloud threat research, including the latest cloud threat report. So Jay and Q, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Matt. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode. To find out more, please visit us at cloudsecuritytoday.com.